everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. It's great to see so many people here. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today. I would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded in this country and the struggle for justice continues. So my name's Hannah McCann and I'm a lecturer in cultural studies at the University of Melbourne. My work is on critical femininity studies and queer theory, and I'm here today to talk with Carolin Emcke about her recently translated book, How We Desire. And just to note, there'll be time at the end for an audience Q&A. So to introduce Carolin, she was born in 1967 and is a highly regarded German author, public intellectual, journalist and philosopher. She studied philosophy, politics and history in London, Frankfurt and at Harvard. From 1998 to 2013, she reported from war and crisis zones including Kosovo, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Gaza and Haiti. She has written a number of books, and in 2016 she received the Peace Prize of the German book trade. How We Desire is the first book by Carolin to be translated into English. So thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks a lot.
So just to get started, it's really interesting how personal this book is. It's autobiographical and very philosophical about the impact of the silence around desire. So I'm wondering, what was the impetus for you behind writing this very personal narrative?
Yeah, that's a good question to ask. I have this editor at my German publish house that worked with me since the first book I wrote, and at some point I texted him and I said, I'm writing something but it's never ever going to be a book. And he wrote back immediately and said, that's what you always say when you're writing a book. And so I think indeed, actually, whenever I write a book, whether it's a more essayistic, more analytical, or whether it's a more personal, subjective book, I usually write because I want to come to terms with something. And I think there are writers who really think about an audience and who really, want to address an audience. If I think about an audience, it scares me to death. So whenever I write, in the end, something that turns out to be a book, in the beginning it is something that I'm struggling with. It's a question that's haunting me, that I don't know another form how to come to terms with it. And in this particular book, it was the suicide of a boy that I went to school with when I was a teenager. And I didn't think so at the time, but retroactively thought that he was struggling with his gay desire. And whenever I learned about his death, when I heard that he had committed suicide at the age of 18, ever since I had that sense of guilt of having survived. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask, how many in the audience have lost someone at school or in your family due to suicide? And so I think when I started the book because I was able to start writing about it. I just wasn't able earlier.
So one of the really interesting things for me in this book, when you're writing about your own reflections on desire and sexuality, is that you spend a lot of time talking about your relationships and desire for men, which is really...
That was confusing to you?
No, it wasn't at all confusing to me, not personally at all. I think it's it's something that is really difficult to articulate in a world where we have to come out and identify in particular ways and with particular words. And the difficulty of articulating how that has changed over time, or, you know, if you identify as a lesbian now, have you always identified that way? That grappling with those kind of questions, that was so fascinating to me because you spent so much time talking about that.
Indeed. I mean, I think part of what was so complicated about writing this book is exactly what you say. I think there is such a preformed discourse on what desire is supposed to mean, what gay desire is supposed to mean, whether the term gay is accurate or not, whether, you know, and I thought I'm only going to write once in my life a book about my own desire, and I thought, well, if I write a book about my own desire, I really want to find my own vocabulary. I wanted to make sure that it's really as confusing, ambiguous, insecure as it felt to me. I did not, and evidently, you know, when people read the book, they said, "Why didn't you call yourself a lesbian?" And you think, God, you know, I'm glad I managed to express my desire at all, so don't start attacking me for not using the words that you want me to use about. So as you know, I mean, there's a political discourse about this, there's an aesthetic discourse, there's an academic discourse. It's highly contested territory. And evidently, this contested territory of desire and sexuality and gender is always also about lacking power, seeking power, about empowering certain individuals or groups. So there's never an innocent way of writing about desire. And so I think my way of coping with that evidently philosophical and political problem was to try to really return in my imagination to the time and the age at which the beginning took place, meaning trying to think and feel the way again that I felt when I was 10, 12, 15, 17. And I think that helped me not to avoid all these difficulties that you address, but it gave me a little bit of more, I don't know, space maybe.
And yet, so you talk about kind of not having an understanding that this idea of homosexuality could apply to you as a young person, even though you knew that homosexuals existed, but that this wasn't something you could apply to yourself. And I thought it was really interesting you talk about how it was kind of easier to have relationships with men because the longing was recognizable, or it was easier, or something like this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's funny, usually I think very often if LGBTIQ give an account of their youth, they retroactively rationalize their lives, and as if everything made sense and was leading toward that direction of the life they're living at the moment. And I could give such an account. You know, I played soccer and, you know, I had an elder brother, and I don't know, you know, I don't know. I could give a number of these codes and practices that are stereotypically associated with someone lesbian, and yet at the time, I had no fucking clue. And so I was really, really late in understanding my own queer desire, and I was really late in falling in love consciously and then practically with a woman. I was 25. And so it's difficult because then you think, well, was I just stupid before? Did I not have that desire? Or did I have the desire and interpret it as something else? But then I think part of this struggle or this conflict is something that everybody has at that age. That is not something that is particular to queers, I think. I think what is so interesting about this time period of puberty is that we are permanently sensing emotion that we can't really give a name to. We are angry, we're mad, we're longing for something without really being able to give it a name or to understanding it. And evidently, if the desire or the emotions that you have are emotions and desires that are censored, criminalized, rejected, negated, it is extremely difficult to give what you feel that name. Not because you're scared, just because it's not as likely as another interpretation to that desire. So I don't even know if I didn't, I don't even know if I didn't desire women at that age. I just know I did have relationship with men that I did enjoy. That's also important to say. For me at least, it's the first time I knew I wanted to have sex with a woman, I was unbelievably scared that I would have to reinterpret all my encounters with men prior to that. I thought, well, what if suddenly now, if I'm with a woman, everything that I've had until now seems wrong? That wasn't the case. It was just something very different. But it was important for me when I told this book that I can tell the story of desire as confusing and not understood as it was for me at the time. Maybe I was just unbelievably slow, but I hope not.
And yet there was some connection that you felt with Daniel at that time, and in retrospect, in spite of that lack of awareness.
Yes, if I'm allowed, I would like to say a few words about this boy, because there are these, I think, typical dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, probably at any high school, and whatever the markers are, why some boys or girls are considered to belong or to fit in or to be appropriately male or female or whatever is considered, relevant at the time. There was nothing about this boy that I could now say marked him as other. Nothing. And yet, he was somewhat always pushed out of the center of, the group dynamics. And I knew at the time it was wrong. I knew at the time it was arbitrary. But I didn't have a sense of why was he chosen to be excluded. And I felt guilty for not being able to stop it. And then later I learned, there was rumors, or I thought, that he was struggling with his own sexuality. And so when I then learned about the fact that he had committed suicide, I felt guilty. I was also, retroactively to some extent, I think I'm surprised. Why did I manage to go through that without being excluded or without being pushed out or without, I don't know, suffering so much as he did. And I think in addition to the question of sexuality was definitely also a class issue. Also part of the reason why I think he was kicked out a little bit. But I think at the time the relationship that I felt that I had with him was less because I sensed a similarity in the desire respect, but because I felt responsible somehow.
So what's interesting is that with these discussions of the confusion and the kind of messiness of desire, there's always so many claims that people have around these identity positions, particularly when it comes to representations in the media and in Hollywood. There's so many debates about how people kind of stake their claim to their identity term. I mean, how do you feel about those debates?
I feel sometimes left out of them, and I think for me what's important about gay desire or queer desire, first of all, is it's something I do. It's so for me it's really about doing something, not necessarily yet an identity. It becomes an identity because of the social world and the political world we live in. And evidently, depending on which context I move, it's considered more relevant, it's considered less worthy than something else. So I think I feel very, very strongly about a queer identity the moment I'm in a context where that is rejected. I feel much less so in a queer bar or in a club. But if you had asked me for my own sense of, I don't know, queerness is already such an identity term. I would say it's first of all really about something I do. It's really about desiring, a woman and falling in love with someone, and it's really about the sexual practices. So it's a more sort of Foucauldian original understanding of doing something, not yet an identity. But then, of course, there's also a sense of belonging to something that never fits. So I think I have a strong sense of not fitting to the norms. Or I'd rather think actually that the norms don't fit for me, this way around. So it's a sense, I think there's a sense of permanent displacement, or an exile, but it's an exile with lots of friends and a great community in a place where we can really have fun. And I think that last aspect is one that is for me very, very important. When I grew up, the books that existed or the films that existed where there was any representation of homosexuality, it was always tragic. The only films that I knew at the time were films where either women loved another woman without ever being able to touch or kiss or have, God forbid, have sex, and or they would get raped, or they would get beaten up, or they would commit suicide. And so when I wrote this book, what was for me really key about writing this book was, yes, I do want to write about all, the political configurations, all the contested territory of a body or gender or sexuality, but at the same time I desperately wanted a book that represents gay happiness. I wanted this to be about, about joy. I wanted to write a book that I didn't have at that time.
Do you think that if you were a child now or a young person growing up today, that you would have, expressed yourself differently? I mean, is it really...
It's a really, really good question. I think it very much depends on where you grow up. I don't know how that is in Australia. In Germany, there's still huge differences between urban cities and environment and rural areas. I don't know how that is here. I would think that so much has changed and there's so much has become much easier than at the time when I grew up. And yet each generation, I think, or each individual within a particular social and cultural and religious context has to struggle against a normativity that still exists. I mean, it's still heteronormative culture and society, and so I think each individual within his or her place has to find a way to express this. And I would say before I wrote this book, I had already written a number of books, and I'd worked for, at that time, I think 13 years as a war correspondent. Then I published the book, and ever since I published this book, I'm this queer philosopher, or queer writer, queer whatever, and suddenly people assume, because I wrote about queer or gay desire, everybody somehow associates me with identity politics or with Judith Butler or with gender studies, and whereas all of that is fine, but I studied with Jürgen Habermas in Frankfurt School. I'm a universalist, and so it's that even in 2019, if you say you're queer or if you write about these topics, there's a whole set of associations and attachments that come along with it that I think wouldn't have happened had I not written this book. And so I think even in 2019 there is a culture where it's okay if you're gay, just don't make such a big fuss about it. And I think it's a little bit similar for people of color. I think sort of there's some form of acceptance or tolerance as long as you're grateful for the way you're being included. The moment you criticize, certain regimes or certain structures of power or whatever, it's a little bit less tolerant.
I want to pick up on your experience as a war correspondent in a moment, but also thinking about something you said just then around compulsory heterosexuality, basically. I was interested in this idea. You said at the beginning of the book, I'm quoting you here, looking back, I have the impression I was always too early or too late, never in step with time. And it occurred to me, this is a very queer thing to be kind of out of time and out of sync.
Is it?
I think
good.
it is.
Oh, it makes me feel better now immediately.
Yeah,
okay.
The kind of, what I mean is when we're talking about compulsory heterosexuality and those things you were talking about, how we have to be and how we have to behave, it's also about the kind of way that we're meant to progress and develop. And the things that we're supposed to do in our lives, have relationships, marriage at a certain time, babies at a certain time, things like that. And that as being a very kind of heterosexual linear project. So I'm wondering your thoughts about queerness and time.
I haven't thought about that way, the way you phrase the question. So I thank you very much for this. I think it relates probably a little bit to what I said before about being in exile and always being displaced. Maybe that's similar. But I do wonder whether some of the sentiment that I expressed with that phrase, saying I was always too early or too late, I do think many straight women would say that also about their own lives or about certain moments within their lives, and to the extent that general normativity about certain role models, about certain images of or codes or practices or expectations of what it means to be a woman or female, and straight. And I think many women of not only the generation prior to myself, but also of my own generation, would also say that they never really knew how to fit into these categories, or they failed on some and maybe, managed to cope with others. And so I do think that this complex web of norms about what it means to be a woman or a man, or about certain relationships, but I think that does repress everyone. And maybe we as queers even have an advantage because we're so out of this system, we're so unwanted within the system that to some extent, I think it's probably easier even to accept one's own, is it a misfit or to be a misfit? And when I published the book in Germany, I received many letters from men and women in their 60s, in their 70s, in their 80s, who wrote about their own time, the way I write about the 70s and the 80s and my socialization in school and then afterwards. They described, what kind of ideological framing had an impact on their sexuality or on their gender identity. And it was quite moving because it was like a history of Germany according to subjective narratives of sexuality. And it wasn't only, gay or queer men and women, but it was women of, all generations and all sexualities. So in that sense, I think indeed there is, yes, a connection between normativity and time and the sense of being too late or too early, but I do think that it applies to everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really came out in your work is around how no one lives up to norms, even though they're structuring our lives. But if you do appear to fit the norm, you don't necessarily have to question that. So
yes.
There's this expectation that if you are queer, then you've had to kind of think about it and tell everyone. But if you are straight, then you don't have to think about sexuality.
Absolutely. I think that's the trick about norms. I mean, the trick about norms is on one hand that they suggest that the majority of people adhere to them or fit in, whereas I always think much less people fit into the norm than the norm suggests. And then you don't think about normativity unless it excludes you. I think if you're white, you don't really think about, racist practices or structures or legislations in your society because you're not the one who's being pulled out of the train and asked, for your identity papers, or, you're always answered or always let into any club. And so I think if racism isn't part of your daily experiences, you're living a life in which you could doubt that racism exists. Whereas if if the discrimination is a daily experience, you can't afford to think racism doesn't exist. And so I think in that sense, to give an example, I was recently at an Italian restaurant in Berlin, and I was supposed to meet friends who are in their, 70s, and it's a straight couple, and me and my partner were sitting in the Italian restaurant, and the waiter just wouldn't come. And I don't know, we made all kind of, how silly it is when you look like this and he doesn't react, and so we tried. And in the beginning, you think, okay, he's just busy and he hasn't really seen you. And, then we made all kinds of attempts and he just wouldn't really attend us. And then this couple came in, our friends, and this sort of really glamorous, straight, 75 and 80-year-old couple. And they sit, and this first second, the waiter appears. And so my partner and I stare at him, and we tell them the story, and they said, well, we wish we could see this happening once, because it never happens to them. And so it's not, they weren't questioning that it was true what we were telling them, but evidently it doesn't happen to them. And sort of for me, as a white person, there are certain experiences that I'm spared. And so I think that is what's so complicated about norms, and what I really hope with my writing to achieve is that people feel curious about these questions, or want to understand these questions, even though they are not affected by the norms on a daily basis.
And on that, one of the things that you talk about is kind of the problem of only seeing people in terms of sexuality as well. So people not having to reflect on their sexuality if they're straight, but by the same token being, I guess, stereotyped or put in this kind of box when there's all these other complicated, intersecting kind of aspects of identity. So how do you think we can actually change our ways of seeing people? How do we do that work to see beyond the narrow categories and to see the complexity?
I think it's very, very difficult, because, to be honest, when I meet someone who differs from me in, some cultural respect or religious respect or whatever, I am also curious to learn something about that particular feature or property or way of life that differs from myself. So to some extent, I make the same mistake. It's like I don't know how that happens to you, but very, very often I have straight people who desperately want to talk about sex with me just because they think I'm an expert.
It happens to me too.
Okay, it's kind of weird. Now I'm used to it. Now I'm happily chatting about whatever they want to chat about. But I think the question you ask is really, really important. And I think it requires the honesty that indeed I am also at first interested about certain religious practices if I don't know enough about them. But I think that lasts only for about an hour. And then once you're beyond that, then I think it should be possible to see beyond these simple stereotypical features of identity. But I think on a broader or more political or more social level, I think that is the task, not just of educators in school, but evidently of theaters, of films, of series. What kind of representation do we get? I don't know how it's here in Australia, but in Germany, if you're gay, you only get invited to talk shows to talk about either gay marriage, adoption of children, or sex. You don't get invited to talk about tax laws. And if you're Jewish, you do get invited to talk about the Middle East conflict or about anti-Semitism, but you don't get invited to talk about, I don't know, whatever, sex. And so, of course, if we think about representation, we have to think about the social, cultural, and political institutions that produce and generate these representations. I think that's where it's really, really important to pluralize the images, not just of LGBTIQ, but of Muslims, of refugees, of people of color, and I remember I recently saw a series on some lousy American whatever crime series, and it was the first time that I saw someone I really identified with. And, I'm 51, and I thought, that's incredible. There's really a figure that I, totally identified with. And to some extent, that's shocking that it takes so long, or that there's such a lack of creativity within the film industry that they permanently reproduce these same stereotypical ideas. And I think the same applies, and I think maybe it's even more important to school books. I think we really have to think, what is the canon, what is being taught in schools, what kind of literature, what kind of art education, what kind of musical education do children get? I don't know how it is here. It's extremely contested in Germany. The question of school books, whether they're allowed to mention queer sexuality, whether they are allowed to mention that it's should be respected, or whether it should only be tolerated. There's huge evangelical movements opposing this. Is this similar here?
We've had a huge debate here around a program called Safe Schools, which was a nationwide program basically teaching students about sexuality, sexual identity, gender identity, and diversity. And it became this kind of intense focus for the right in the country, a target for saying things have gone too far, political correctness gone mad, our children aren't safe, and this kind of intense...
What does it mean with our children are not safe?
Like, yeah, so it's really hard to explain how awful it was, this debate. So it's not safe from being kind of indoctrinated around sexuality and gender, according to the right.
But the funny thing, what I really love about that, really love about that argument is it can only be indoctrinated or unsafe if you assume that the sheer knowledge of the existence of homosexuality, you already know what I'm saying, is immediately making them gay. You think, that's really, really funny. I wish it worked that way. God, the market would be just so much bigger.
But,
And you would say, no, it didn't work that way when I went to school and I read all these, books that evidently featured heterosexual couples. I didn't turn out straight nevertheless. So, sexuality doesn't work that way.
But I suppose by the same token, acknowledging that when there's silence and when there's not articulation of the diversity of sexual possibilities and possible desires, that does limit and stall how we can think about ourselves. There's a truth to this idea that
that's true.
We, when these things are articulated, that opens up a space of possibility. And unfortunately, the way that this debate, I feel, plays out is that people kind of harden into a camp of just opposing that and being like, no, talking about it isn't going to change how anyone feels, but I don't think that's necessarily true. People, I mean, this is kind of what your book is saying, right? Like, having those possibilities presented to you as something that might be applicable to you could change.
Yes.
Your
Yes, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that my desire only existed because I knew it was a possibility. But I would say I had that desire, and it allowed knowing about the possibility of such desire made me able to accept it, or to give it a name, or to give it a reality, but not in the sense that it generated a desire that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And I also think that the talking about it, at least in Germany, has a very, an additional importance, because, there was a real persecution of homosexuals during the Third Reich. Homosexuality wasn't just criminalized, but people were sent to concentration camp. And so there is not just a tradition of a taboo. There's more than that, and the taboo was attached to real fear of being persecuted and of harm. So I think opening up the possibility of at least speaking about it is, in such a country with such a history, really, really crucial.
So I want to talk about before we go to questions, your time as a war correspondent and how this changed your thinking around desire and these kinds of questions that we're talking about. Because, as you say, Germany has its own specific, very intense history around this. I mean, Australia, homosexuality wasn't fully decriminalised until 1997 in Australia. So all these different contexts that you're visiting have these very complicated legal, political histories that affect these things. So can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, I should say I traveled, you mentioned a number of the countries. I traveled to many Muslim countries with very strict legislations on homosexuality. And of course it meant that I could not say how I live or how I desire. And anecdotally, one should say that the normal classic way of getting to know each other in one of these countries would be that at some point people would say, and what's your family like, and what does your father do and your mother do, and are you married? And that's the moment when you have to think, what do I now say? Do I say, no, I'm not married, or do I say, I'm not married and I happen to be gay? And usually I would just say, no, I'm not married. And then you would usually, get an offer of becoming the third wife of the cousin of the person you're talking to, because evidently I'm, older than 18 and still not married, so they think you're really desperate, and they might just offer you, some help. And then again, you have to think, do I say, no, thanks very much, very kind, or do you say, do you have a female cousin, or so it, it's a permanent, constant reenactment of lying about who you are, and there are moments when you feel enough trust, or someone well enough when you can say, this is who I am and this is how I live. But it's not just about your own safety, but it's very often also about the safety of the other. It means I have to be very careful in saying who I am, because I might risk the situation of my translator or my driver, or the people I want to talk to. So that only concerns my own situation, and at the same time, but I have a passport, I have a ticket, I can leave. I'm not really at risk. unless I would get kidnapped. That evidently wouldn't be a good situation, let's put it mildly. But of course, I'm permanently meeting people who live in contexts where it's not just about the question whether they can express their homosexuality, but it's what kind of lives can they live at all? Can they go to school? Can they learn? Can they choose who they want to live with? If they're trans, it's unbelievably complicated and risky. So it just means to travel and work in contexts that show you once more how thin the skin is that you think protects you. I think it only reaffirms how vulnerable our situation still is. And that having said that, I should say, I feel that also when I travel within Europe to certain areas. I mean, it's not just Afghanistan or Iraq, but there are certain areas where I don't really feel comfortable holding hands with my partner. We do have right-wing parties now in parliaments. We do have right-wing parties in certain governments or coalitions in Austria and Italy, in Hungary, whose ideology or whose political program is utterly chauvinist, is very homophobic. And so, I don't have to travel that far to get that sense of vulnerability.
Mm. Well, we're going to open up for questions now, and we have just over 10 minutes. So if you have a question, put your hand up, and there will be roving mics going around that will know when the next question's kind of coming up. We are going to prioritise diverse range of question askers, women of colour, other folk. So please make a question, not too much of a comment if you can.
Now I'm curious who's other folk.
Dankeschön, Carolin. Mein VW ist immer noch kaputt. I've been thinking about consciousness as you've been speaking. And this George Miller, who wrote the sort of big text on psychology in the mid-1960s, who said something like, consciousness is a word smoothed by a million tongues. And I wonder about this kind of issue about desire and gender and identity is also an issue about consciousness, because so much of that is in the non-conscious. And I wonder, as a writer, about the bringing of that into language and how you dealt with that and how you found that, because you're writing about vastly different things than you've written about before.
I have to think a bit before I answer. I think part of an answer to this is that I didn't immediately, when I wrote this, write with that level of consciousness, but I tried to actually in the beginning really recall certain emotions. I tried to recall certain scenes and moments in high school that I felt, were still causing me pain when I thought about them. So I think, correct me if it's a wrong description of my own book, but I would say there's lots of storytelling, so to speak, in the book, and I think I didn't necessarily have to completely understand what's happening in the scene while writing the scene, but through writing and re-remembering these moments, I got a different level of consciousness or understanding of. So I think there's a bit of a cathartic moment also about writing about these experiences. What was much more conscious was the composition of the book, the structure of the book. I organized the book relatively carefully by thinking about certain motifs, certain themes. It's written like the musical form of a fugue. So there are certain images, certain themes that re-emerge over the course of the book in different contexts, and there's sort of variations to these core themes. And that is something that I really, really thought about. I thought about how to connect the storytelling, the memorial, subjective parts with the more philosophical, more analytical part. And if you read the book, you will see it changes. There's different threads. There's the story of myself in school, going to school, the story of this Daniel. There is one thread that's only about music. Maybe we should mention this. The book is as much about music as it's about desire. And then there's sort of the more philosophical, more analytical, more political parts to it. And I think I learned about this while writing the book.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't bite, yes. Here there's two.
A few up the front.
If you think about the tensions you were talking about, and particularly when you were talking about the Safe at Schools program, and the sense of that relationship being renegotiated between what we might see as an old way of thinking around parents owning their children, and then being able to define what happens to those children to a certain point, versus and the state intervening in certain ways and creating certain structures in which they're in. And that change of that relationship to the state saying, well, in the case of, say, schools, that no, this is a universal program that's going to run, all children are going to have access to that. Those tensions that are occurring, that you're playing out, as you were saying, when you have very right-wing political parties pushing for that, any of your thoughts about that, about what we're seeing as that part of what I think is being renegotiated in that space?
It's interesting. It's interesting because I think you're right that these movements or parties who oppose sexual education, I don't know what the term is here, in schools, that they indeed do claim that it's their own task or responsibility and they would not want the state to interfere. And yet I would think, well, there is always the social and political realm. There's always power structures. There's always ideologies interfering and configuring what parents do think is only their own ideas about bringing up children. So to some extent, I think the ideology of these parents is within their own blind spot. They don't see how ideologically preformed it is what they want to teach their own children. And that's one aspect. And I think the other aspect is that I would always say, if parents were really, really sure of the traditions that they care about, the values that they care about, the faith that they care about, they wouldn't feel so threatened about this. And so, I mean, so, you know, so I think I would strengthen. You know, I would always say, look, I'm not opposed at all to parents wanting to have their own particular religious or non-religious values being taught to their own children. Of course, they can do that. But there is no tradition and there are no values that can exist without people believing in them. So if the kids don't believe in them, you know, that there isn't much that you can do about it. And that, I would say, is the beauty of both love and desire and faith, is that you can't control it. You can't decide to believe in God, and you can't decide not to believe in God, and you can't decide to desire someone or to stop desiring someone. So I think that's what I would try to tell these parents if it really was only about a parent's concern. Now, we all know it's not only that. We all know there's a real propaganda and cultural war going on, and then with these people, it doesn't make sense to discuss that way. There was another one.
Thanks for the talk. I was just wondering about the English translation, whether you were completely happy with it or whether you felt something was lost in translation or...
No. I mean, it sounds like... But that's in each language, in each foreign language. I'm always surprised who I am or how I might sound in that language. It's just because, I mean, even though I do speak English, in German I'm really, really sure whether I'm rude or slightly rude or a little bit funny or totally stupid. Or, you know, I really have a sense for the gentleness or the rage or the anger. And in English, I do have a sense for that, but evidently not completely. But what was very important to me about this particular book, and there I think the translation is beautiful, is the rhythm. It's really, I'm a musical fanatic or nerd, and so it was very, very important to have a certain rhythm in the book, and I think she got that incredibly well, and I'm very, very happy and honoured to have that translation.
We've got time for one more question, if there is one. There's one up the front. Oh, we'll just wait till the mic.
The phone,
yeah.
microphone.
Thank you so much. I love your gorgeous infiniteness. I was just wondering whether there are any passions or causes that that might kind of surprise us, like you said before, how people often try to limit you, or when you go into those talk shows and they wanted to talk you to talk about certain things. Yeah, or any cool synchronicities that have happened to you, or...
Well, you want to know passions that don't fit into the image. Is that I think probably the love for classical music is one. I think that's what nobody expects, I guess. I'm a soccer fan. Now that's a stereotype, cliche, dyke thing to love. Okay, good question. So the question was, is there a topic that I would never, ever get invited to? Well, definitely classical music, I think. That is something I would love to, you know, they're making us There's an alarm
It's okay.
that says "shut up."
You can finish your.
No, I think probably classical music is it. It's also about the love for the countries that I traveled to. Very often people think if you're a war reporter, it's all about suffering and pain and risks, and it's actually from every single trip that I've made to regions of crisis, I came back really enriched. And I felt that people in the most impoverished areas of the world are incredibly generous and hospitable. And so what I think nobody expects and nobody asks me about is people always ask, well, isn't it really difficult to travel? And actually, it's much more difficult to return. And so, I don't know, that's something I don't get to talk about often.
A fascinating note to end on. And I just wanted to point out that we have Hares and Hyenas up the back selling copies of the book, and Carolin will be signing copies up in the back corner as well. So thank you so much for coming tonight, and it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. So thanks
you. A lot. Thanks very, very much. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.